Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Many thanks for the invitation, Thiago. And my name is Olivier Jimenez. I work in Montpellier in southern France. I'm gonna switch. Yeah. Today I'm gonna tell you a bit about what we're doing on large carnivores in our team and how statistics may help to address some questions we have about their ecology and their management. You may find more about what we do in our research group through our website. I wish I could be there with you in person, and my family and I visited Lisbon 2 years ago, and we enjoyed your town very, very much, and we'd love to come back. Before I dig into the details of my talk, I'd like to give you some definitions to set the scene. First, what is ecology? Well, if I talk to my mom, she thinks I'm traveling in amazing places, just wandering about, looking for funky animals. What ecologists actually do is a bit less glamorous. Ecologists do fieldwork, they collect data to test ecological theories. They also do lab work, again, to collect data and test ecological theories. They also attend boring meetings, get tired, and fall asleep. In brief, ecology is the study of how organisms interact with one another and with their non-living environment. Now, what is statistics? Well, again, what my mother thinks I've been doing all these years is playing with a bunch of computers, and my desk looks like a scene from the Matrix movie. Not to say that my mother has seen the three Matrix movies, but I don't think she has. What society thinks I do in this new era of fake news is telling another form of lies by playing with numbers. You probably know this sentence. There are three types of lies: lies, dumb lies, and statistics. Another question worth asking is whether statistics is the art of turning correlation into a causation. In reality, what statisticians do is trying to make sense of data and uncertainty with some sort of formalization, often using equations. They spend long hours debugging code and running models. And like ecologists, statisticians attend the same boring meeting, get bored, and fall asleep. Statistics is usually defined as the science of collecting, organizing, presenting, analyzing, and drawing conclusions from data. I insist on the collecting, organizing, and presenting steps. Statistics is not only about analyzing and drawing conclusions. Now, the question I'd like to raise is, can statistics and ecology make a happy wedding? And I will try and answer that question in the context of the biodiversity crisis. It's estimated that 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, and we often refer to it as a mass extinction, with a species that disappears every 20 minutes. This assessment was made in 2019 by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. And besides species threatened with extinction, the assessment also documents how human actions have changed many aspects of nature and its contributions to people. The event gathered 150 experts from 50 countries, and the expertise was peer-reviewed by the scientific community, then presented in plenary sessions, and a summary for policymakers was also released. The global assessment got a lot of media coverage in newspapers in many countries, and also through social networks from people like Greta Thunberg, Leonardo DiCaprio, of course, and or Al Gore again. In parallel to the global assessment on biodiversity, the IPBES also released an assessment report on scenarios and models of biodiversity and ecosystem services. In brief, it's a best practice toolkit of the approaches that can be used to decide on policies and actions by governments, the private sector, and civil society. It's pretty clear that in this context, statistics and ecology and the two together have a role to play. And it's also an opportunity for the new generation of ecological statisticians or statistical ecologists. and for you, I guess. The cool thing is that you're not alone, and we're not alone. There is an international community in statistical ecology, a friendly and welcoming community. And this is a picture of the conference we held in 2014 in Montpellier. And you might recognize someone in the back here. Following this conference, the local organizing committee, together with the scientific committee of the conference, wrote a paper, a meeting report, in which we described the hot topics in statistical ecology. Hot in 2014, of course, but still hot for some of them, I think. Feel free to check it out, it's open access. Okay, enough of general considerations. The main objective of my talk is to try and illustrate how we can combine statistics and ecology to kind of contribute to the conservation of biodiversity and large carnivores in particular. We have 4 species of large carnivores in Europe: wolves, bears, lynx, and wolverines on the right. Globally, large carnivores historically covered almost all the world's land area, and now intact large carnivore guilds, meaning those with 0 carnivores lost, occupy only a third of the world's land. What's the situation in Europe? As I mentioned earlier, we have 4 species of large carnivores. And these species are spread over 42 populations, and their main characteristics is that several of these populations are transboundary. That is, they live across several countries. Also, these species were once at the brink of extinction. They have recovered in 20th century, and this recovery is often used as an example of success story in conservation biology. What are the reasons of this recovery? Well, the reasons are, among others, agricultural abandonment, with the comeback of ungulates, the main prey of large carnivores, and large carnivores species have also benefited from laws on nature protection. The recovery of large carnivores also means more interactions with humans. Here, a lynx near a big city in Switzerland, a wolf looking for food in Germany, or a bear wandering around near a village in Italy. These interactions come at a cost for humans with depredations on beehives here or livestock, and conflicts between groups of people too. Here, a group demonstrating and arguing that pastoral activities are not compatible with the presence of large carnivores. Here, another group demonstrating and saying no to the hunting of wolves. And by the way, we don't hunt wolves in France, the species is regulated through legal killings. In that context, there is a need for approaches that can be used to decide on policies and actions by government, the private sector, and civil society, in line with the IPBES report on scenarios and models. And to dig a bit deeper into the assessment report, we must move away from peaceful decision making and use science to anticipate change. And I'm going to try and illustrate just that through 4 basic questions. How many? How do we count large carnivores? Where? How do we know where they are? What for? Why do we care about how many and where? And who? Who is involved in these human-wildlife conflicts? Let's start with the how many question. Well, counting things sounds easy, huh? But is it really? Specifically, can we count animals exactly? Well, counting animals in their natural habitat is difficult. Difficult due to weather conditions, for example. Difficult when species habitat is not that open. Also, animals do not make our life easy, and their behavior can make it difficult to count them. Of course, counting is also a matter of skills, with some observers being more dedicated to the task than others. Overall, what we see in the field might not be exactly what there is, and we're missing individuals due to the issue of imperfect detection. Fortunately, we have methods in statistics to estimate the number of things while accounting for this issue of imperfect detection. I will leave the famous popularizer of mathematics, Johnny Ball, explain how capture-recapture works with ping pong balls. Okay, the first application of capture-recapture dates back to Laplace in the 80th century. Laplace proposed an estimate of the population size of France by using 2 samples, like in the previous video, one from the churches and their birth registries, and another one through a census of the population. Nowadays, to analyze capture-recapture data, we use modern statistical tools called hidden Markov models. Briefly speaking, these models allow you to distinguish the ecological state you're after from its observation. By ecological state, true state, I mean population abundance or animal survival. Hidden Markov models were initially developed to guide satellites, where the ecological process would be the true position of the beast, and the observation are coordinates that are prone to measurement error. Okay, now we don't have nothing as fancy as that for wildlife. This is much less glamorous, actually. This is what we're dealing with, scats. And why scats? Well, because large carnivores are shit machines. And these animals are kind enough to leave other signs of their presence in the field, like this brown bear in Greece. We then use the DNA contained in scats or hairs, like we saw on the bear, to infer the identity of species or even individuals through sequencing. Lucille Baresco and Sarah Cubain in our team have worked a lot with this data during their PhD and postdoc. They have produced estimates of abundance for wolves in France. Here, the raw counts are not the whole story, and once we correct for imperfect detection, the estimates are higher than what we see. We see here that wolf abundance has increased over time, and we have around 500 wolves today in France. An important thing to note is that these estimates come with a measure of uncertainty in gray here that's sometimes difficult to convey to stakeholders. You may find more about this work in two papers by Sarah here and another one by Lucille here. These results have been used to establish a perspective about the long-term viability of the population. Our results are also used by the Ministry of Ecology and that of Agriculture to define the quotas for regulation of wolves with the aim to decrease depredations on livestock. How our scientific results are used is the subject of much discussion in our team. To put it crudely, it's sometimes difficult to accept that the results of your capture-recapture analysis are used to kill animals. Okay, so we've seen that every carnivore leaves DNA, like these three bears here, who've left scats around them. Not every scat is found and not every individual is detected. These are the gray scats here and the gray individual here. On the wolf example, we've seen that what we count is lower than what is actually present. Another difficulty besides counting individuals is that not all carnivores have their home range in the focal region, in the region of interest. For example, here, the black bears live outside the study area, which is in gray here, okay? But we do find some of the scats within our study area. And if we don't deal with this issue, we might end up with counts higher than what is actually present in the study area. The intuition to fix the problem is quite simple, really. What if we could use the spatial information in the recaptures of an individual to infer its home range? For example, here we have 4 detections of the same brown bear. From these observations, we should be able to say something about the home range of that particular individual. Often in the case of large carnivores, we will use DNA to infer this home range, okay? To do that, we need to extend standard capture-recapture models through point process models. And here I just wanted to give a shout out to Janine Hillian, who has done a lot to introduce these complex models and tools in ecology. As you might have guessed, the extension of standard capture-recapture models would consist in using the spatial information we have in capture-recapture data. This is what we call spatially explicit or spatial capture-recapture models. And these models were first introduced 15 years ago, roughly, yesterday then, and are still the object of active research. In brief, we model the probability of detection as a decreasing function of the distance between the center of the home range of an individual, here, and its detection using DNA samples, for example. it makes sense to assume that the further you are from the home range of an animal, the lower the probability of detecting it. This is how the spatial information is included in the model. From here, you may estimate number of animals and their home range and assign these animals to one side or the other of the border. As a case study, let me take you to Scandinavia. We had data from 2006 to 2013 with more than 4,000 samples on more than 400 individuals. By we, I mean a team of awesome colleagues and friends from Norway, Sweden, France, and the US, and in particular Cyril, Pierre, Richard, and Maddy. What we estimated using spatial capture-recapture models are yearly specific abundance estimates for Norway, in green here, okay? And in gray there, the abundance estimates that ignore the presence of animals that do not live actually in Norway, but in Sweden, Russia, or Finland. And these animals are falsely counted in Norway when the spatial information is ignored, right? And there is a systematic overestimation of abundance, which has obviously important consequences in terms of management. More details in the paper by Richard. Richard has also led the extension of this approach in several ways recently. Besides the genetic data here, we now combine in the model dead recovery data from hunting bears and also spatial and temporal covariates on the characteristics of the bear habitat. And the model has also been extended to deal with more complex demographic processes like survival and recruitment. This gives full flexibility to infer survival and recruitment, density and population size, and space use. And in turn, we can use scenarios on the management of the species to forecast its fate in terms of density and population size. This is what we get for bears, wolves, and wolverines, where each map represents population densities for a year, from 2012 up to 2018. Bears are distributed in several core populations here. Wolves are limited to southern Norway, and wolverines are everywhere but in the south. Thanks to Pierre Dupont for the wonderful illustrations, and Richard for doing the heavy lifting. You may check out our recent paper to know more, if you'd like. And there is also a package, an R package coming with it, called Nimble SCR. Okay, this was the how many. What about the where question? I don't know about Portugal, but in France, decision makers and politicians love indicators, simple quantities that summarize complex information. And with regard to biodiversity, our biodiversity agency releases all sorts of indicators every year. For example, the proportion of the country occupied by large carnivore. And on this graph, we see that this proportion has been increasing since 2003. And we have around 5% of the country occupied by wolves in 2017. Okay? The proportion of area occupied by a species is what we call occupancy in ecology. And like population size and density, this occupancy is difficult to estimate in the field. Let's take an example in which your study area can be divided in, say, 40 cells, out of which 10 are occupied, the ones in yellow here, okay? Then true occupancy is 25%, 10 over 40. Now, for some reasons, you manage to detect the species in only 6 sites out of the 10 sites that are actually occupied, the red cells here, okay? Then you obtain a naive estimate for occupancy of 15%, 6 over 40. In other words, occupancy is always underestimated if imperfect detection is not accounted for. How can we do to distinguish a true absence from a false absence due to imperfect detection? Well, on an example, let's assume that links are distributed this way, with a rectangle here where the species is absent, while it is present at all the other sites, okay? You go in the field, and then you get ones and zeros for each of these sites where you detect or not the species. The key here is to repeat sampling, like in capture-recapture surveys. This is how you separate a true absence from a non-detection. And in our example, for most of these sites, there is at least one detection, a 1. At these sites here, we have at least one detection, and so we can confirm the presence of the species. But for two sites, we have non-detections only zeros, okay? Then the only question that remains is whether the species is present at these two sites or not. Was it bad luck that we missed the species every time we went for sampling it, like in that site? Or was it truly absent from it, like in this site? Again, we will use hidden Markov models to infer the fate of these sites by explicitly separating observations from ecological states. Here, the states are a species is present or not at a site, and the observations are the species is detected or not at a site. And Julie Louvrier worked a lot during her PhD on this family of models. She survived her PhD despite spending endless hours waiting for some results coming out of a computer. You may check out some of her work, in particular this paper in ecography, in which she built occupancy models to map and explain the organization of wolves in France, and also other papers of hers in which she extends standard occupancy models to cope with common issues like heterogeneity in the detection process, with sites where the species is more detectable than at other sites, or the occurrence of false positive when there are misidentifications of the species you're studying. For Portugal and Spain, Monia Nakamura is doing similar work for wolves with occupancy models during her PhD. As an example, I will focus for a few slides on lynx. The species is monitored in France by collecting all sorts of signs of its presence, like depredations, collisions with cars, tracks in the snow, camera traps, or scats and hairs they leave behind. The distribution in France is spread over three main populations in the Vosges Mountains here, in the Jura Mountains, and in the Alps. And from the raw data, we see that the Jura and Alps populations are quite steady, okay, through time, while the population in the Vosges Mountains is going extinct. The main causes of lynx mortality are collisions with cars and poaching. The cool thing is that the Biodiversity Agency has set up a network of professional and citizen observers for wolves and lynx. This network has around 4,000 members that are trained to recognize the signs of presence for both species. And here you have maps of the sampling effort over time, and the darker, the more observers. Okay, and you see that the sampling effort has really expanded over the years, mainly driven by the expansion of wolves. And in modeling occupancy, it is key to accommodate areas that are simply not sampled, like the gray A here areas here, to make sure that the zeros are not taken for non-detection by the model. And also we need to acknowledge heterogeneity in the sampling effort, with areas in yellow, for example here, and dark green here, okay, and account for this heterogeneity in the detection probability. In passing, we have started using Shiny applications. Shiny is a friendly user interface to R, sorry. It helps to visualize data and model outputs, and it's useful to communicate these results with to stakeholders and decision makers. For links, here is what we get. In red, we have the raw data, just the detections and non-detections in the field. Okay. In black, the solid line is the proportion of area occupied by links as estimated by occupancy models. Overall, what we see is that occupancy is underestimated when detection is not accounted for, exactly like in our toy examples from earlier. There are also some differences in trends. In recent years, the occupancy analysis seems to spot the decrease in presence due to the extinction of population in the Vosges Mountains. This is not the case for raw counts. This is because the trend in these observed counts here are blurred by the increase in the sampling effort, hence the importance to distinguish the ecological process from its observation. These results are directly used in the National Action Plan for Lynx that is being created as we speak. There is also a National Action Plan for wolves in which Julie's results are used to inform a decision. And this action plan has pastoral activities in its title, which is very important, I think. It emphasizes the issue of coexistence between wildlife and human activities, and what we often call human-wildlife conflicts. Here is a wolf attacking a sheep at night, and the vet from the biodiversity agency inspecting the dead body the next morning. To decrease depredation, several strategies are implemented in France, regulation with legal killings, and protection also with dogs. Like us, these dogs had to adapt and work remotely. And on wolf depredations, we are lucky to have Oksana Grant, who is doing a PhD on the issue. She's studying spatial and temporal patterns in wolf attacks on livestock, and how regulation may or may not decrease these depredations. Obviously, depredations here on this map follow trends in wolf distribution. It's therefore crucial to know the occupancy of wolves in space and time, of course. Oksana is using statistical models to quantify hotspots of wolf depredations. Quantifying wolf occupancy is a key to the detection of hotspots, and knowing when and where these hotspots happen is important for management. Here is an example in the Alps with hotspots in brown circles here. If you'd like to know more about Oksana's work, check out her preprint on hotspots of wolf depredations on livestock in France. Again, we're using Shiny apps to build friendly interface to visualize maps and communicate our results. Oksana has nice examples in the appendix of a paper. Okay, enough of the where. Let's spend some time thinking of the what for question. Why are we doing all these fancy models? As I have said before, the recovery of large carnivores comes with more interactions with humans. Here, a grizzly bear with her 3 cubs crossing a road in a national park in the state of Wyoming in the US. In that case, humans are waiting for the bears to cross the road and the story ends well. But it's not always the case. Here, the results of collisions between lynx and cars. As I mentioned earlier, collisions with cars are the main cause of lynx mortality in France. Can we do something about it? One option is to build wildlife crossings, passage for animals to cross roads safely. But then the question is where to build the wildlife crossings. Sorry. To answer this question, we use individual-based models in the team. A quick shout out to Stephanie Kramerschat and Uta Berger, whose contributions have been instrumental to the development of these models in ecology. If you had only one thing to remember from my slides on individual-based models or IBMs, it's that these models are built on individual rules, and that these rules lead to the emergence of population patterns. What do I mean by individual rules? Take a lynx, for example. It may stay where it is or disperse. If it stays, it may decide to engage in reproduction if it finds a mate. If it moves, it is to find a territory, okay? And moving or staying and breeding or not are the two main decisions a lynx has to make over a year. And while making these decisions, lynx are also subject to mortality by natural causes and collisions. They age also, and they live in habitats more or less favorable to them. And you can code formally all these steps in a computer program for each animal of a population. This individual-based model feeds on models itself. Each component is the output of a statistical model, a regression model for kills, an occupancy model for habitats, and capture-recapture models for abundance and demography. We implemented this big model in R and spent most of our time building an interface for users using Shiny. Why R? It's free, it's a statistical program, it has nice graphical capabilities, and the workflow is reproducible. To build the model and interface, we went through several workshops with stakeholders. Why workshops? The idea is that if we want stakeholders and decision makers to adopt what we propose, we need to have them involved from the beginning of the process. I had never done that before. It's definitely much more work than just working on your computer doing fancy stats, but it's also more rewarding. What you do is actually used by others, and not only in the academic circle, but in real life to answer practical questions. We had folks from hunting federations, national parks and protecting areas, wildlife conservation NGOs, forest and biodiversity agencies, highways and railways companies, and state departments. This work was led by Sarah Baudouin, who was doing her postdoc with us and has been hired by the French Biodiversity Agency since then. Happy ending or happy beginning, because Sarah is still working with us and makes the link between our lab and the Biodiversity Agency. Sarah built an interface that allows to implement scenarios like building roads, creating corridors, reintroducing links, etc., and build wildlife crossings. Imagine you are a GIS folk working for a highway company that wishes to build a wildlife crossing. And you just have to click on the road where you'd like to build this crossing in the with the interface. And then in the background, the individual base model is run with these modifications and tells you what the consequences are for the links population. More specifically, you get a diagnostic on the population variability. Say we look at the three mountains where the links are, Vosges, Jura, and Alps. The result, you get a projection of the population over the next 50 years following the building of the wildlife crossing. And the results might be a decreasing trend for the Vosges mountains on top, stable trend for the Jura mountains in the middle, and increasing trend for the Alps, okay? You also get simple messages as diagnostics, and this is much appreciated by stakeholders who do not have the luxury to spend a month or years studying the mechanics of complex models. This tool is at the core of several actions of the soon-to-be action plan for links, and we're kind of proud of it. That's all for the what for. Last, I'd like to talk about the humans involved in this issues of coexistence. Why? Well, we realized some years ago that management in France is mainly driven by ecology of the species, how many, where, and the human dimension is simply ignored. But the human dimension is obviously intrinsic to conflicts, and taking management measures that ignore the human dimension leads to an increase in conflicts. This is what we witnessed with the reintroduction of brown bears and lynx that were carried out without accounting for people perception and attitudes toward the species. Let's get back for a minute to definitions. Conservation conflicts are defined by Steve Redpath and colleagues as situations that occur when two or more parties with strongly held opinions clash over conservation objectives, and when one party is perceived to assert its interests at the expense of another. This definition makes it clear that human-wildlife conflicts are often about human-human conflicts, which means that we need social sciences to better understand these conflicts. And in the following slides, I will illustrate how we combine ecology, statistics, and social sciences in our team to contribute. First discipline we mobilized was sociology. Sociology is a science that investigates the structure of groups, organizations, and societies, and how people interact within this context. It was perfect for what we had in mind. And we used the regression framework to correlate the attitudes of people towards large carnivores with social and demographic variables. Hopefully, we addressed relevant correlations and didn't end up blaming Nicolas Cage for drownings in swimming pools. As a case study, we went back to the Pyrenees Mountains and studied brown bears. We conducted interviews and sent 3,000 questionnaires by emails. And these questionnaires were... This was a chapter of Blaise Piadalu's PhD. Here, in this picture, apparently tired by too much interdisciplinary work. We have a paper with colleagues from social sciences in which we found a spatial variation in the attitudes of people in the Pyrenees towards brown bears. More precisely, we considered 6 counties where the bears were present and found significant relationship between the attitude towards bears on the y-axis here and age on the x-axis. Some counties were neutral, like these two ones in blue. Okay. In some of the counties, like the green ones here, attitude was overall positive, okay, whatever your age. While in another county, attitude was clearly negative, whatever your age. And we discuss in the paper the reasons for such heterogeneity. We think it's due to a different history of the presence of bears, differences in the duration of exposure to conflicts, and differences in pastoral activities. We also study the language of people involved in human-wildlife conflicts with linguistics. Here again, we mix ecology, statistics, and social sciences. We use the collection of written texts called corpus as our dataset. These texts were newspapers articles. The objective was to study how the media covered the conflicts between wolves and human activities, with the idea that newspapers would reflect in some ways the public opinion. We studied wolf in the Alps, and we considered a local newspaper that covers events in the area where the wolf is, and a national newspaper. We had lots of articles, and to mine these datasets, we used structural topic modeling. It's a statistical method that finds structure in huge corpus with hidden topics, and then these topics are used to tag documents in big data corpus. We had almost 1,200 newspaper articles that would have been quite difficult to read for a person, and we used modeling to extract topics automatically, of which two were dominant. One was about regulation, wolf regulation with legal killings, and the other was about debates on the wolf-human conflict involving stakeholders and institutions. We also assessed the trends over time in the prevalence of these two topics in the corpus. We found an increase in the topic on wolf regulation at both local and national scales. This is coherent with the French management policy, which has increased killings over the years. Now, on the topic about debates, there was a slight increase in the topic about debates in the national newspaper. And in contrast, there was a strong decline in the local newspaper. And by inspecting the articles most related to these topics, we could interpret these trends as a focus on the human dimension in the local newspaper, while the national newspaper covered the issue through the lens of interactions between humans and large carnivores. You may find more on our results in Marie Chandelier's paper in the joint work with colleagues working in linguistics. Okay, that's all for the 4 questions. I'm almost done. To wrap up, I'll conclude with a few random thoughts. First, and to echo my introduction on the biodiversity crisis, we may ask, is there hope? Is there any hope for biodiversity? I want to think that there is some hope indeed. This year, 2020, has seen the finalization of a global framework for biodiversity for the next decade and beyond. So there are reasons to be optimistic. Another point I'd like to make, and the question you might ask is, how was all that even possible? How is it that we can fit these fancy models to make sense of ecological data? Well, there was a revolution in applied statistics with the development of powerful and flexible algorithms to make complex calculations. These algorithms are key to implement the Bayesian approach that has many applications in ecology. Here, the physicist Nicolas Metropolis, who developed MCMC algorithms with colleagues, he's standing in a room where you can see the Maniac computer he built at Los Alamos in the 50s. Maniac was big, had little memory, and was slow when compared to your everyday laptop. And it's difficult to grasp the progress that have been made in 16 years. We also have neat methods to model the ecological processes we're interested in, while accounting for issues with their observation. I have mentioned several times in this talk hidden Markov models. And these models are becoming some sort of a unifying framework in ecology. And if you're interested in, check out our recent paper, who was led by Brett McClintock and Roland Langrock in Ecology Letters. These algorithms and models are great, but they come with a responsibility. Humans build them. Humans use them, and humans are not flawless. Cathy O'Neill refers to algorithms and models as weapons of math destruction, and we should always be aware of these biases when building and using them. To conclude, I hope to have convinced you that combining ecological questions and theory with data and statistics leads to knowledge. And what is science if not knowledge? And this equation also leads to better decisions, hopefully. Thank you very much for listening. And the credits here.